Let's talk about dialogue. Dialogue is what we call the things characters say out loud. Adding dialogue to your story can make it more interesting and dramatic. There are a couple of rules for punctuating dialogue that you need to know. The first one is put quotation marks around the part that is spoken. So this conversation would look like this. What time should we meet? He asked. Let's meet at 5, she said. The quotation marks act just like the speech bubbles. They wrap around the spoken words to show that they are said out loud. The part that is spoken is called the quote, and the part that tells you who said it is called the speaker tag. Rule number 2 is the end punctuation of the quote stays inside the quotation marks. Notice that this question mark is inside the quotation marks. This quote ends in a period, so that would go inside the quotation marks too. But if there's a speaker tag after it, then the period changes to a comma. This is the only time you would change it. Question marks and exclamation points don't change, only periods. Rule number 3 is if the speaker tag comes before the quote, put a comma after it. So if this quote came after the speaker tag instead, that comma would go back to being a period and you'd add a comma after the speaker tag. Rule number 4 is start a new line every time the speaker changes. This conversation happens between Josie and Ruby. Every time the speaker changes, a new line starts. Because readers know this, you can sometimes skip the speaker tag completely. We know that the last line was said by Ruby because it's her turn, even though there's no speaker tag on it. Now let's talk about when to use dialogue in your story. In a previous lesson, we looked at how some parts of your story should be scenes and some parts should be summaries. The scenes will be the more dramatic and interesting parts of the story, and usually scenes contain dialogue. In Frog, only 2 scenes contain dialogue, the conversation with Bree's parents at the beginning and the end of the story. What's important to know about dialogue is that you don't have to include everything that everyone says. Instead of writing out an entire conversation in dialogue, you can just summarize most of it and only show the most dramatic parts. Suppose you were going to write about a girl named Tina who saw her friend Brian cheat on a test, and she wants to tell him that it upset her since she studied really hard for it. Their lockers are right next to each other, and she sees him after school. Their conversation might start out like this. Hi, Tina said. Hi, Brian said. What are you doing? Tina asked. Not much, Brian said. Oh, Tina said. This is boring. Nothing important is happening right now, so instead of including all of this back and forth in your story, skip it. Instead, you could write a quick summary of what's going on, then get right to the interesting part of the conversation, which happens a few minutes into it. After school, Tina was at her locker, and Brian showed up. After exchanging small talk for a minute, Tina finally came out with it. I saw you in math, she said. What do you mean? Brian said. With that cheat sheet in your lap, she said. I saw it. Now we have some serious tension. This is the kind of dialogue you want to show. Remember this when you're adding dialogue to your story. Cut out all of the boring stuff and only put into dialogue the parts that are actually going to be interesting. Lastly, let's talk about a few more things you can do to keep your dialogue interesting. The first is to vary your speaker tags. In other words, don't use the same kind of speaker tags over and over again. You may have been told to avoid using the word said at all costs. This is because your teachers want you to use more interesting words. That makes sense, but it's really easy to overdo it and still end up with some pretty uninteresting dialogue. Let's look again at that boring conversation from before. Now let's replace the word said with other words. It's still a boring conversation, but now it's just dressed up with fancy speaker tags. In fact, the constant switching up of verbs in these speaker tags is kind of distracting. The whole conversation should be replaced with something more interesting. If you look at most published novels, you might be surprised by how often the author actually uses the word said. Or when they do replace it, it's often with something pretty simple like answered. Instead of replacing the word said, most authors vary their speaker tags in other ways. We've already looked at how you can put the speaker tag before or after the quote, but you can do a lot of other things too. You can use physical gestures instead of a speaker tag, like in this sentence: My dad looked up from typing his shoes. What happened? You can use interior monologue in place of a speaker tag, like this: I couldn't believe it. Are you kidding? Or you can sometimes skip the speaker tag completely, like in this sentence, if it's obvious who is talking. Another thing you can try is to paraphrase a character's speech instead of quoting them directly. Read this conversation. We don't see the coach's direct quote. Instead, the author paraphrases what he said. Maybe this is because his speech would be too long, or maybe it's a way to show us that the protagonist tunes it out. Either way, it's a different way to show the conversation instead of including every bit of dialogue. The third technique you can try is to create pauses in your dialogue with other storytelling modes. Let's look at this conversation again. We can create more tension if we add other stuff between the lines of dialogue, like this. This description of Brian nervously messing around with his books takes a while to read. In that time, no one is talking, so it's building up more of the suspense and creating an uncomfortable pause. Here's another example. The speaker tag has been placed between two quotes, along with a little bit of narration. That brief pause is about the same amount of time that Bree would have paused between the first sentence and the second one. Since she would naturally pause there anyway, you can place the speaker tag and maybe something else right there to create that pause. Now, look at the draft you're working on for your story. Try doing these things. Add dialogue to the most dramatic parts of your story, remove boring dialogue, and use some new techniques to make your dialogue more interesting.